James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." He said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" And they replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to him, "The cup that I drink you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they became angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." This is the word of the Lord. It doesn't take long to figure out that there are plenty of contemporary examples of what James and John are about in this passage. It's not without reason they're called the sons of thunder elsewhere in Mark. I imagine living with them would have been a very difficult task. So I ask you, is it not the same thing when you're dealing with 4 very talented people up here, all of whom could take any part of the service and do a really great job with it? You've got to figure out each person, whoever wants to be great among you, you got to take whatever part is dealt you. 1 week from today, those of us who are of voting age will be voting here in Richardson anyway on some propositions. 1 year from today, there will be national elections, and hopefully people will be going to the polls. You know, it's interesting that the people who were responsible for developing our Constitution felt that when we voted for our representatives and our senators and our presidents, we would vote for people who were wise, who had good sense, who had the greater good in mind, and not necessarily people with whom we agreed. So what has happened? What has happened? Now we end up voting for people who represent our opinions and forget about the greater good. It's all about us. They do what we want, which is exactly, of course, what the 2 brothers wanted from Jesus. If you'll look at verse 35, these guys have got chutzpah. "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask you." Really? Would you do that to Jesus? I think all of us have a certain amount of that in us. What we want is a bigger piece of the action than what you're giving us right now. What we want is to be able to sit at your left hand and your right hand. In other words, we want to have power. We want to have positions of importance. Do you guys follow that? So Jesus, if you'll look further down, this is in verse 38, you do not know what you are asking. Yeah, what they're asking about is the cup that they believe they get to drink from, which has to do with traveling with Jesus and teaching and preaching, and then maybe having to fight at the end in order to install Jesus as the big king. Oh yeah, they're ready for that cup. They're ready for that. You don't know what you're asking. And Jesus says back to them, do you really think you can do this? And here's the part that I love, verse 39. We are able. Now, literally in Greek, that word means we have the power. That's literally what it means. Dunamitha. We have the power to do this. Really? Honestly? We are able. You know, we get so self-important sometimes. When we're convinced that we've got the right answer, we've got the right reaction, and these two guys suffer from what Martin Luther King called the drum major instinct. Okay, I want you to picture that. The drum major instinct means you're out in front of everybody. You're leading the parade, and you're doing whatever that thing is that drum majors do, and they're coming after you. You're leading the charge. One of Teddy Roosevelt's sons called it being the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. The level of self-importance that we give imputed to ourselves is really pretty amazing. We call it independence. We call it creativity. We call it assertiveness. And most of all, we call it leadership. But look at what the 10 disciples do who are not involved in this. And this is in verse 41. When the 10 heard this, they became angry with James and John. What a shock. It doesn't mean that they didn't think the same way that James and John did, right? They're mad at them because they actually verbalized it. They actually said something to Jesus about it. Some of you may know a writer by the name of Robert Wuthnow. He is at Princeton University, and he did a wonderful study a few years ago called God and Mammon, in which he interviewed personally 2,000 working people. And of those 2,000 working people who agreed that they had to help the poor, of those 2,000, 80% of them contended that in order to receive help, they had to kind of look like them. They didn't say it in so many words. Instead, what they said is, in order for the poor to have our help, they need to look like us. That is, no matter how badly they suffered, their families needed to stay together. They could not have a broken family. They had to be hardworking, willing to put in long hours. They had to be responsible in business and in personal life. And then, no problem, I'll give all the help I can. It was an interesting survey to me because I don't measure up to all of those things sometimes. I don't always measure up to being responsible in my personal and business sense. I don't always measure up to being a hardworking guy. So far, I have stayed the husband of one wife, but that's because she's so marvelous. We all have issues We like people who look like us. We like people who behave like us. And we often want to be just a little more assertive than the next one. But Jesus, he takes these two guys and he makes a teachable moment out of this whole deal. I want you to look at verse 43 now. Yes, there are tyrants who lord it over. There is the power that comes from coercion, but he says, you know, among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. And here's 43, but it is not so among you. It is not so among you. Jesus is teaching them, in effect, that servant leadership is his style. If he hasn't let that sink in yet, it certainly will sink in when he innocently walks the road to the cross. Servant leadership is his style. And I have to say, there's real power in that kind of servant leadership. Once upon a time, a young man was very active in his church, but had never actively committed himself to Jesus Christ. And then it happened one day that he suddenly was able to say out loud, I think I've found what I've been looking for. And down through the years, he ended up founding a ministry in East St. Louis that dealt with mainly kids who were in poverty. He had many different experiences with crime that were committed upon his person. He lived in a very dangerous part of a very dangerous city. But his comment when asked years later about his commitment, here's what he said. I thought I had found Christ. I had not. Christ had found me. I thought I'd get good gifts out of knowing Christ, and I have. But mostly what I got was a job to do for Him, rather than what I wanted to do myself. Power is to be found, Jesus says, in love, in the love that gives, in the love that is not always wanting to put me first, no matter who gets the credit. Love seeks the good that is truly the greater good. I invite you to listen to the words of a man named Carlo Corretto. He writes, don't worry about what you ought to do. Worry about loving. And by loving, you will find out what is for you. So Jesus called them and said, it is not so among you. Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. So let's let grace energize our optimism. Let's let grace energize the love that we already have. We already have that, and we do know how to share it. Let's let grace energize us in such a way that we can honor others just as we honor ourselves. Amen.